Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. This is episode 2 in our series on utilitarianism and consequentialism. Um, in this episode, I want to read the introduction by John Troyer to the classical utilitarians, which is a Hackett text. Hackett Publishing Company is a really fantastic philosophy resource. Pretty much anything they publish, I would recommend as far as translations go. Um, they're also highly affordable and generally just very accessible. So they have good, reputable, and rigorous introductions and overviews and compilations. Um, they fund like Spinoza's complete works is Hackett, the most recent translation by Shirley, I believe. And Plato's complete works is also by Hackett. Plato's Five Dialogues is by Hackett. And whenever Hackett undertakes these compilations, they undertake revisions, um, like Grube, GM Grube. Let's look at the list. GMA Grube translated it, but then the complete works were edited by John Cooper, and John Cooper revised. Presumably, there was some translation revisions by John Cooper in the complete works, but I know that in the Five Dialogues, for example, he said it comes like a few years after, in like 2002, versus the complete works is 97, 5 years later, or 5 years before. So the Five Dialogues, which is like the Socratic texts, it was published by Hackett 5 years after the complete works was published. It was like just a slimmer excerpt. And in the translators or the editors and translators introduction, whatever it was, John M. Cooper explained that he revised those texts even further. And I know that there are different introductory pages in the different books that emphasize different things. So Hackett's a great company. Really appreciate them. Sorry, you can't see this yet. Good time to catch that early on. And now you can. And I was looking at the teaching page to look at the dates. So like 2002, 1997. Anyway, if you're just not even looking at the screen, that's fine too. I'm kind of excited about this new feature I just found in Chrome where I can put two tabs in the same tab. So like I'm only capturing my Chrome window. I'm not capturing my second screen. I could, if I didn't have a second screen, I wouldn't be able to like, it would just get really cluttered to see my Zoom. And it's nice to have these not compartments, but containers to organize these silo spaces to organize things in. And like I could capture the second screen and put up two windows side by side. I've always been able to do that with Windows, the snap feature. I want to move to Linux one day. Shh, don't tell it Windows. I'm not smart enough for Linux yet, but I think it's safer and more stable, more private. Um, but yeah, now I can have the guiding questions up at the same time as like the text. How cool is that? So anybody like watching can kind of know multitask. All right. I explained a lot of the concepts. I'm not going to do it again. If you missed the first episode, just go watch that. Um, Presumably you didn't jump ahead. The second and third episodes, I think they'll just be me reading. And this is the introduction. Thank you to John Troyer again for writing this. Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, was an exceptionally able and influential philosopher, but he was also, in some ways, a rather strange man. He died in 1832, but but he can still be seen ensconced within a glass case at University College London. Bentham donated his cadaver for instructive dissection by T. Southwood Smith, a leading advocate for the legalization of such donations. but directed that his skeleton should be preserved. Bentham further requested that the skeleton be stuffed out to fit his clothing and preserved as what he dubbed an auto-icon. Technology being what it was, his executors had to settle for a wax model of his head, but the original remains and is kept separately, preserved after the manner of South African headhunters, quote unquote. Bentham hoped that the preservation of his body and its periodic display would remind later generations of, quote, the founder of the greatest happiness system of morals and legislation, end quote, and draw their attention to the virtues of that system. So I'm thinking that it's like too small for you guys to see this. I think that's better because there's no point in having the guiding questions up if you can't see them. And you also probably don't want to just hear my voice without, I mean, if you're doing the podcast, you can't see me. But I think there's a human engagement component to, I don't know, the visual display. Bentham's hope has undoubtedly been realized, at least to some degree, but today his remains attract many fewer visitors than do the auto icons of Lenin and Chairman Mao. Despite this, the greatest happiness system, as expounded in the writings of Bentham and Mill, is still widely influential, while the systems of Lenin and Mao are moribund. I mean, are they? The continuing vitality of the greatest happiness system is not difficult to understand. It embodies a very natural and compelling model of rationality. This model, which dominates much of contemporary economics, as well as decision theory, cost-benefit analysis, and public choice theory, sees rational action as an attempt to maximize net utility, i.e., the result of summing the benefits and costs and subtracting the latter from the former. This view, which is frequently called means-end rationality, goes back at least to Aristotle. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle asserts that we cannot deliberate about ends, but only about the means by which ends can be attained. If we assume with Aristotle that happiness is the highest good attainable by action, and hence the aim of politics, we get something very like Bentham's view. Um, yeah, so that's a misreading of Aristotle. That does not understand happiness as eudaimonia. That reduces happiness to a flattened felt experience. But in Aristotle, different fe experiences have different feelings of happiness. They don't all elicit the same happiness. There's a different happiness for different pleasures. And happiness itself is not just one pleasure or something that you can add. It's also not the thing behind it. It is the um, separately complete good. Indeed, it is tempting and not implausible to interpret philosophers as different as Adam Smith and Chairman Mao as agreeing that the goal of social institutions is the maximization of net happiness and disagreeing only on the most efficient means of realizing that end. Of course, philosophers who share this vision of the proper function of social institutions, like law and morality, may differ on more than the best methods to attain it. As Aristotle noted, there is widespread agreement that happiness is the goal, but considerable disagreement as to what constitutes happiness, as we were just saying. For Bentham, the answer is simple. Happiness is just pleasure in the absence of pain. The value or disvalue of a pleasure or pain depends only on its intensity and duration, and can, at least in principle, be quantified precisely. Given this, we can reconstruct one line of Bentham's argument for the principle of utility as something like the following. The good of a society is the sum of the happiness of the individuals in that society. The purpose of morality is promotion of the good of society. 3. A moral principle is ideal if and only if universal conformity to it would maximize the good of society. 4. Universal conformity to the principle of utility. Act always so as to maximize total net balance of pleasures and pains, would maximize the good of society. Therefore, the principle of utility is the ideal moral principle. This line of argument, which will be explored more carefully later, see below, has considerable cogency. Indeed, Bentham seems to have thought the premises were self-evident, or at least so obvious as to need no argument. He suggests at the beginning of chapter 3 of the Principles of Morals and Legislation that he has given an argument for the first premise, writing that it has been shown that the happiness of the individuals of whom a community is composed, that is, their pleasures and security, is the end and the sole end which the legislator ought to have in view. But when one looks in prior chapters for this demonstration, one finds only the claim that the interest of the community is the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it, plus the suggestion that this follows from the unsupported assertion that the community is a fictitious body. Bentham also asserts premise 4 as if it were a truism. The principle of utility is capable of being consistently pursued, and it is but tautology to say that the more consistently it is pursued, the better it must ever be for humankind. See below, page 16. I'm not going to read those, the see belows. The second and third premises, which constitute a version of what might be called the functional account of morality, are particularly congenial to philosophers who, like Bentham, model morality on the law. Bentham was trained in the law, though he never practiced, and his interest in legal reform was his ruling passion. His earliest writings were stimulated by the dissatisfactions he felt with English law, and the Principles of Morals and Legislation was intended as the introduction to a never-completed model penal code. The line of argument sketched above was not, of course, all that recommended utilitarianism to Bentham. The theory also fit nicely with many of the legal and social reforms that Bentham favored, e.g., reform of the law, universal suffrage, and educational reform. Its chief alternative, what Bentham calls the, quote, principle of sympathy and antipathy, end quote, makes the rightness or wrongness of an action depend on the feelings of approbation or disapprobation it elicits in those individuals who judge it. This is, according to Bentham, a principle in name, but not in reality. It offers no consistent guidance, and where it seems to, it is likely to mislead. In the case of the law, for example, it frequently suggests penalties that are, by utilitarian standards, overly harsh. Only utilitarianism can offer a systematic and coherent guide to legal and social reform, or so Bentham claimed. His claim attracted a number of particularly able and energetic followers, including several members of Parliament eager to put the theory into practice. Bentham himself, though at one point in 1790 quite eager to gain a seat in Parliament, came to realize that his gifts were for thought and writing rather than active political participation. His inherited income, however, allowed him to indirectly influence political action. In 1824, 34 years later, he founded the Westminster Review, which became the organ of the philosophical radicals or Benthamites. One of the chief Benthamites, though his high office in the East India Company prohibited active political involvement, was James Mill. This is the father of John Stuart Mill. James Mill's dates were 1773 to 1836. So passed away 12 years after Bentham started the Westminster Review, which became the organ of the philosophical radicals or Benthamites. James Mill, despite his demanding administrative position, managed to contribute articles to the Westminster, wrote an important series of articles for the Encyclopedia Britannica, in which he applied Benthamite principles to practical issues ranging from freedom of the press to colonial administration, and in 1829 published his influential Analysis of the Phenomena of the Human Mind. He also took charge of the education of his 9 children, the oldest of whom was John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. So John Stuart Mill was, so when I say Mill over and over again and talk about Mill's utilitarianism, quote unquote, um, I'm talking about John Stuart Mill. That's not to say that James didn't influence utilitarianism. He raised and taught it to his son. Um, but John Stuart Mill marks a more distinct divergence from Bentham than James did, in my limited understanding. And there's no telling, of course, how much of that was pedagogical as he was being raised by his father. But I think from the writings that were published. I also know that John Stuart Mill was uh, a feminist, um, just in the sense of respecting either his pen pal or his wife. I can't remember exactly who it was, but he definitely had women in his life that he considered capable of enriching and teaching, enriching his mind, his intellectual development, and teaching him quite a lot. Sorry, that was split incorrectly. Enriching his mind, enriching his intellectual development, and teaching him quite a lot. You had three verbs there. James Mill was a cold and distant father, and an unpleasant and condescending husband, but he knew the value of education, and he knew that children were capable of learning a great deal at an early age. With Bentham as his guide, and after 1814, his neighbor in Queen Park Square, London, James set about giving John Stuart what he hoped would be the best education an effective utilitarian could have. James was lucky in the choice of a pupil in this educational experiment, for John Stuart was exceptionally gifted. He began Greek at 3, and by 8 had read all of Herodotus, much of Xenophon, and 6 of Plato's dialogues. John Stuart's account of this education in his autobiography is both fascinating and frightening. His education gave him, at age 20, the knowledge of a political theorist twice his age. It also led to what he called a crisis in his mental history. Although brought up on utilitarian teachings, he had not read the works of Bentham himself until 1821, when his father gave him Dumont's edition of Bentham's Traité de Legislation. Um, it sounds French, presumably Dumont. Bentham and Mill would have been English. This book gave John Stuart a mission. He would devote his life to making certain that social institutions lived up to Benthamite standards. This mission directed and energized the next 5 years of his life. But in 1826, in one of those moods when what is pleasure at other times becomes insipid or indifferent, he lost his calling. In this frame, quote, in this frame of mind, it occurred to me to put the question directly to myself. Suppose that all your objectives in life were realized, that all the changes in institutions and opinions which you are looking forward to could be completely effected at this very instant. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you? And an irresponsible self-consciousness distinctly answered no. At this my heart sank within me. The whole foundation on which my life was constructed fell down. All my happiness was to have been found in the continual pursuit of this end. The end had ceased to charm, and how could there ever again be any interest in the means? I seemed to have nothing left to live for. Mill hoped this depression would pass with a night's sleep, but it persisted for months and only began to lift when he read in the Memoirs of Marmontel an account of the death of Marmontel's father, and Marmontel's resolve, though then a mere boy, to help his distressed family. Mill was moved to tears and reports that from that moment my burthen grew lighter. I've also had like points where it became difficult to persist with my work. I'm not talking about something recent or anything like that. I really haven't had that recently. Just have been overly busy. But with the passing of an ex-partner, a domestic partner, we lived together for 3 years. We'd separated and stayed friends and still loved each other when she passed. Um, I think I've said this before, but obviously you realize like grief is a kind of destructive thing at first. And the more you grieve, the more you realize you don't want to keep destroying things because that leads to more grief. So it just doesn't make sense. Um, and um, anyway, what struck me about this resonance was originally that James William James, I guess about 100 years after Mill, 50 to 100 years after Mill, and across the Atlantic Ocean in America. Um, he's a philosopher, brother of novelist Henry James. He had a similar like depressive episode in his late 20s. Traveled a lot to Africa. Very kind of go-getter. Um, he was an explorer. I think he might have done like hunting or things like that. But he did eventually hit that wall. And what got him out was just finding the similar utilitarian sensibility that by believing in yourself or by believing in a course of action or having faith in the outcome of a course of action, you make it more likely that that course of action will succeed. And he was able to get himself, or he was able, by redefining what standards he needed for truth into something that was energetic and affective and momentum and health based, as well as like certainty based, he was able to find more energy to get up out of the depression and continue to help the world. And that's amongst many things why I like the introduction by G.H. Bird in the selected writings. Um, and why we'll cover it in the next series. But I wanted to bring that up here because it's cool that, no, it's not cool, but it's relatable that Mill and James both went through this sort of slodge of sludgy slog of I don't think apathy is the right word. It's a sort of weakness, fatigue. Um, but like you can dig deeper and find reserves of giveness, of things you want to give. And that can, just Mill attributed his crisis, at least in part, to an education that placed so much stress on intellectual cultivation that it ignored emotional development. Although he never wavered in his belief that happiness was the summum bonum, highest good, he changed his views on the relative importance of social engineering and personal development. This shift in emphasis can be seen in his later criticisms of Bentham, his increasing admiration for Coleridge, and his growing appreciation of the arts. I haven't read Coleridge. This change was strongly reinforced by Mill's romantic involvement with Harriet Taylor, the wife of a prosperous London merchant. This is the one I mentioned earlier. Falling in love with anyone would doubtless have increased Mill's appreciation of the value of the emotions, but falling in love with a woman who gave aesthetic appreciation a very high priority was bound to reinforce the importance he attributed to the arts. Their unusually intense and intimate relationship began in 1830 and lasted until Harriet's death in 1858. Harriet's husband, John Taylor, was remarkably tolerant of the situation and managed to ignore the gossip and retain his joviality until his death in 1846. 5 years after John Taylor's death, John Stuart Mill married Harriet Taylor, but their earlier relationship prevented an easy acceptance into society as a married couple. Both John Stuart and Harriet were willing at times, it seems almost eager, to live estranged from friends and family, but their isolation must have had cost as well as benefits. Mill's almost pathological um, Mill's almost pathological sensitivity to anything that might be construed as a slight to Harriet, as well as his remarkably overblown descriptions of her virtues, were surely due in part to discomfort about their deportment from 1830 to 1849. It is also unlikely that their unorthodox relationship influenced the doctrines of on liberty. Also likely, I don't know if I said unlikely, I think I said unlikely. It is also likely that their unorthodox relationship influenced the doctrines of on liberty, the work most clearly their joint effort. I read that once 8 years ago. It was good. It's on my shelf. It advocates for free speech and tearing down illogical ideas in not there's no censorship. There's no need for censorship. It just go out, speak your mind, and look like a fool. Whatever its social liability, there's more to on liberty, of course, but I don't remember it. Whatever its social liabilities, Mill's relationship with Harriet helped enormously with this work. It is not clear that his writings owe as much to her thought as Mill sometimes suggests, but her opinions and criticisms certainly helped to shape much of what he published. Her influence is particularly clear in those parts of Mill's writings on utilitarianism in which he criticizes or diverges from Bentham's teachings. But before turning to Mill's amendments to his mentor's views, Bentham's own position needs to be examined more carefully. The premises of the line of argument sketched above may have seemed obvious to Bentham, but each of them raises difficulties. The first premise, i.e., the claim that the good of a society is simply the sum of the happiness of the individuals composing it, raises at least two problems. Sorry, I had a burp. Um, One concerns the distribution of happiness in a society, the other the measurement of that happiness. Since these are problems that continue to worry contemporary utilitarians, they are worth discussing in some detail. Bentham's claim about what constitutes the good of society entails that one social arrangement, call it A, is better than an alternative, call it B, if and only if the sum of the happiness of the individuals in the society under A is greater than it is under B. How the happiness is distributed among the individuals is, according to this standard, irrelevant. If arrangement A has 1,000 people at happiness level 10, while B has 501 at level 20 and 499 at level 0, B will be ranked higher than A. This indifference to distribution worried early utilitarians, and it remains a worry for contemporary supporters of the theory. Some early utilitarians responded to this worry by claiming that their theory was, in fact, sensitive to distribution, and that Bentham's slogan, "the greatest happiness of the greatest number," showed this. Bentham writes that he learned this happy phrase from Priestley, or perhaps Beccaria, but he came to dislike and disown it. In 1829, in an article on utilitarianism composed as an aid to James Mill in Mill's controversy with Macaulay, Bentham writes, "Greatest happiness of the greatest number." Some years have now elapsed since, upon a closer scrutiny, reason altogether incontestable was found for discarding this appendage. On the surface, additional clearness and correctness given to the idea. At bottom, the opposite qualities. What bothered Bentham was that the greatest happiness, the greatest number, at least as he interpreted it, was an injunction to prefer distributions that have the majority of the population at the highest level of happiness, even when this conflicts with the greatest happiness principle. Bentham's worry was the possibility that a dominant majority might have the power to raise its level of happiness by treating the minority very badly. He cites as one example of such a possibility an imagined enslavement of the Roman Catholics by the Protestants in Great Britain. If we assume that the alternative to this policy is enslavement is one of roughly equal treatment for all, then we might be faced with a choice between a situation in which everyone enjoys a reasonably high level of happiness, call it level 600, and a distribution in which the majority is raised to a significantly higher level, say level 700, while the happiness of the minority is lowered to level 10. If we assume that there are 4,000 people in the society, with the minority numbering 1,000, the choice facing us will be one between the following. D1, 4,000 people at level 600. D2, 3,000 people at level 700, 1,000 people at level 10. The greatest happiness principle will rank D1 higher than D2, since D1 contains a total utility of 2.4 million, while D2 contains only 2.11 million. To get these totals, multiply each level of happiness by the number of people experiencing it. But the greatest happiness of the greatest number, as Bentham reads it, will rank D2 higher than D1. since the majority in D2 is happier than the majority in D1. Of course, Bentham's reading of the greatest happiness of the greatest number is not the only possible interpretation of this slogan. But under the most plausible alternatives, the slogan provides no guidance at all in many cases. Consider, for example, the choice between the following. D3, 800 people at level 799, 200 people at level 10. D4, 850 people at level 750, 150 people at level 10. The greatest happiness occurs in D3, but more people enjoy the top happiness in D4. The basic problem is that the greatest happiness of the greatest number asks us to maximize both of two values that can vary independently. Given this, it is hard to disagree with Francis Isidro Edgeworth, the brilliant 19th century utilitarian economist, when he writes the slogan has no intelligible or tenable meaning. Of course, appeals, I think it's supposed to have an S there. And appeal, the appeal, I don't know, whatever. Of course, appeal to slogans is not the only way to make utilitarianism sensitive to distribution. Another approach is to add equality to the list of intrinsic goods that must be considered when computing utilitarian sums. This strategy of expanding the roster of intrinsic goods to avoid counterintuitive implications has a long history among utilitarians. Indeed, Judith Thomson attributes the fact that utilitarianism keeps on reappearing every spring like a weed with a long root to its willingness to embrace increasingly ecumenical accounts of the good. The sophisticated modern utilitarian does not for a moment believe that the good is exhausted by the pleasant. The sophisticated modern utilitarian may have a theory of the good according to which the good includes the pleasant. If so, he is very likely to think it includes other things too, such as, for example, distributive equality. This approach requires that we find a measure of total happiness and a measure of degree of equality, and then construe utilitarianism as a theory demanding the maximization of some function of these two measures. There are at least two problems facing this move. The first is developing a measure for degree of inequality. Perfect inequality is clear enough, but departures from perfection need to be ranked in a way that assigns an appropriate number to every possible distribution. This is a difficult task, but economists have developed a number of measures that might provide help. One of the more attractive is the so-called Gini coefficient, which assigns a number from 0, representing absolute equality, to 1, representing maximum inequality. For every possible distribution, the Gini coefficient is sensitive to distributional data that are ignored by measures that consider only information about deviation from the mean. It also turns out that any transfer of happiness from a more happy person to a less happy one reduces the Gini coefficient. Given all this, we might, as utilitarians, decide to adopt the Gini coefficient as our measure of degree of inequality. But having adopted it, how are we to use it? If we take a measure of total happiness that makes societies have a lot of it, then simply adding the inverse of the coefficient won't make much difference. Multiplying by it will make more, but pretty clearly neither simply adding, but pretty clearly neither simple addition nor multiplication is going to work. But rather than looking for more complicated ways of combining equality and total happiness, let's look briefly at a second problem facing this approach, one that calls into question its basic assumption. I haven't eaten today, and I'm having a hard time speaking, I think, because of it. Um, so this is a kind of a short video, but I'm gonna pause it here and then go get some food. Um, I thought we could do this in one video, but we'll call this. Thanks, guys. I'll see you soon. Bye.